Welcome back to College Football Addiction. One of the bigger games in the SEC this weekend is Georgia and Ole Miss. I've got Steven Willis from Locked On Ole Miss on with us to chat about it today. Steven, how you doing, bud?
I'm doing all right, man. Hey, thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you for your time. I know it's a busy time. It's a busy year. It's a good year for Ole Miss. Maybe the best way to look at this is to go backwards a little bit. And man, there was a lot of hype around this game last year, a top 10 matchup, and it really didn't live up to the billing. Ole Miss certainly didn't play super well. They struggled to get a lot of things going, but this year does feel a lot different. Some of that has to do with Ole Miss, some of that has to do with UGA, but this, if there's ever been a chance for Lane to prove some doubters wrong or knock off Georgia, Alabama, one of those teams, it feels like it's this year.
Yeah, and that Georgia game, after coming off the field, Lane Kiffin looked at his staff and is like, hey, we need guys that look like that on the trenches. So Ole Miss went out and got Walter Nolan and Princely and Monmiel and all those guys, and offensive linemen. They've added some size and speed on the offensive line as well, so they can match up and face Georgia on the trenches, because last year Georgia absolutely dominated the game at the line of scrimmage. And whenever that happens, there's not many games that you can win. So ever since Ole Miss walked off the field in Athens, this has been like a West Texas highway to where you can see headlights coming 15 miles down the road. Ole Miss fans have had their eye on this Georgia game for essentially a year at this point. There's going to be 70,000 people in Oxford. There's going to be some crazy weather, potentially like 70% chance of rain. It should be really great, but Ole Miss fans have really been looking forward to this game.
A rainy, sloppy, wet game. Georgia hasn't gotten the running game going, and they're pretty banged up there in the backfield. We think about Ole Miss's passing game, which is number one in the SEC, but they're also top 5 in rushing. So they're certainly, they're an offensive team. Don't get me wrong, but does that favor Ole Miss, a sloppy game like that?
I think so. And if you look at the Vegas line, the line opened at 2.5 points on Sunday on FanDuel, and it's still at 2.5 points. Georgia's favored, even though 90% of the money is on Georgia, which means that line should be getting bigger as the week goes on. But Vegas is like, no, we're good. Come on in. Continue to place your bets. That lets me know that Vegas thinks that they trust Jackson Dart a little bit more in the rain than they trust Carson Beck. And Carson Beck, away from the state of Georgia, has thrown 9 interceptions in his last 3 games outside of the state of Georgia. And Jackson Dart, the last time he played a game, he played a monsoon game against Mississippi State in 2022, and a game that Ole Miss actually ended up losing, but wasn't because of Jackson Dart. Jackson Dart was 30 for 40 in that game, threw for 350 yards, and led a 99-yard drive at the end of the game that would have been the tying touchdown if Ole Miss would have gotten the 2-point conversion. That was kind of his arrival game, and it was in sloppy conditions. I think it is advantage Ole Miss if the rain affects play Saturday.
Yeah, and you talked about Carson Beck and the interceptions that he's thrown against good defenses, some defenses you'd say like, man, you got to stop throwing these. You kind of wonder, glass half empty, glass half full. Does he, does it worry you because he is finally going to snap out of that, or is he just kind of proven like, man, that's just kind of who he is without having Ladd and Brock out there as like safety valves? Like, how aggressive do you think Ole Miss plays this defensively with a quarterback that has been struggling to throw the ball and throw it to the right team, I guess?
Well, Ole Miss leads the nation in sacks and tackles for loss. So Georgia is going to have to prepare for that to even begin with. And that has to be in Carson Beck's mind. I mean, he's only human, right? So if it's raining and you're struggling with interceptions and all of this is going on, it is going to be imperative on Ole Miss to not let him get into a rhythm and start to feel good about himself. If that happens, the Carson Beck that everybody expected could be there will be there. He's a good player. Georgia's a team full of 4 and 5 star players that don't lose to anybody outside of Alabama. They're a good ball club, so that you're going to need help, and the way you get that help, I think, is through Carson Beck.
Yeah. The big narrative or the big talking point. So sorry to bring up maybe a sore subject, but you're not the one doing it, so you'll be fine. The big talking point around Ole Miss has been this injury thing, this Lane Kiffin, using rules to his advantage. That's been everybody's big like, oh, this, that, and the other. What is what is your take here? What are your thoughts on that? The NCAA has put some penalties in. It's the kind of thing to me of like, how do you enforce any of this stuff anyway? But just thoughts on that in a game like this. Like, do you think Lane tries to push the envelope a little bit here, or has the message been received, or what are your thoughts on how that could play in?
Lane is 100% playing 4D chess with faking injuries on this. I mean, that's what it is. You don't have 30% of your team injured going into the Georgia game after not having to play a little bit more than a half of a game against Arkansas. It's just not believable. Now, some of the players on there are really injured. They really are. I think that's the rub here. It's not the fact that all of the players are on there. It's which ones are injured. I think that's where Lane's coming from on this one. He's not going to give any advantage to Kirby Smart. Kirby Smart has better players than just about everybody he faces. Lane is trying to find any little advantage he could get, and on Wednesday on an injury report that doesn't really matter anyway, he sees this as a way to do it.
Do you the narrative around Lane? We kind of mentioned it just briefly a second ago, but the narrative is like, yeah, they're going to run it up against some teams, but when it does get into that big game, it is tough. I think that's a little unfair because when you're an Ole Miss, or like James Franklin gets that because they keep losing to Ohio State. Like, well, Penn State should lose to Ohio State every weekend that they do play because Ohio State just has better players. And so, like, I don't know that it's really fair to say like, well, Lane can't beat Bama or he can't beat Georgia. And it's like, well, nobody else does either, to be very fair. Like, Georgia's lost 4 games in the last couple of years and they've all been to Bama. Like, they haven't lost to anyone. And so just thoughts on, is that kind of an unfair narrative? Do you think that, what are your thoughts just around that when it comes to Lane Kiffin?
I think it's both a fair narrative and an unfair narrative. It's fair in the fact that when Georgia plays Ole Miss, Georgia has the better players on the field. I mean, it's just what it is. If Georgia plays their absolute best that they can play, you don't have a chance to beat them. Nobody in college football has a chance to beat them. That's just what they have built. That's what Kirby Smart has built at Georgia. But Lane Kiffin does one of the strategies to beat Ole Miss, and Mark Stoops did this earlier in the season with Kentucky, is to keep it close, frustrate Ole Miss, and wait for Ole Miss to self-destruct. And that has happened against Alabama repeatedly. That is where the narrative of Lane Kiffin's struggles in these games come from. It is about these decisions that makes where he's going to go for 4th and 3 and 4th and 1 and all of these all over the field at their own 20-yard line. They're going for a 4th down in a game with a team that has superior talent to yours. Lane Kiffin can get in his own way. And that there's enough of a sample size at this point that we can notice that. If Lane Kiffin can learn and play the percentages and just play this game against Georgia the way that Nick Saban would have played a game against Georgia, as far as every 4th down punt, every drive ends with a kick, and you play field position and all of that stuff, you have a much better chance to line up against Kirby Smart. Because I'm going to be real, Ole Miss has not been this close to what Georgia is talent-wise ever. This is the best football team that Ole Miss has ever had. So this is probably the best opportunity to win this game playing straight up. Now, you're probably still going to need to get some disaster plays from the Georgia Bulldogs with Carson Beck throwing picks and inopportune times and you capitalizing on them. But you do have the ability to play straight up and kind of judiciously do the going for it and things like that. It's whenever you do it kind of willy-nilly, it's a problem.
Yeah. What we talked about the running game, maybe a sloppy game kind of favoring Ole Miss at times. What do you see as the biggest advantage for the Rebels in this one?
I think Ole Miss wide receiver, Georgia defensive backs, and it's going to be like superstars all over the field. I'm expecting Trey Harris and Jordan Watkins, even though they showed up on the injury report, to play in this game. I think you would have a hard time keeping Trey Harris off the field. If he can play, he will go. Now, the rumor is, and it's just a rumor, is that he has a groin. And if it's a soggy field, that can obviously exasperate a groin. So that might be a reason that you do not see him in this ballgame. But I think Ole Miss at the wide receiver position, Juice Wells, Caden Lee, those guys against Georgia's secondary, if you can protect Jackson Dart and give him time. Remember, in this Georgia game a year ago, Ole Miss was without both of its starting tackles in that game against one of the top defensive lines in the SEC. That's problematic, especially with the atmosphere and everything that was going on in that game. If Ole Miss can protect Jackson Dart and give him time to throw the football, I think Ole Miss is going to be all right Saturday.
outside of just the obvious, maybe let's look at the other side of that, the obvious of Georgia just being Georgia and recruiting so well and having so much talent. Is there a matchup? Is there a specific position that gives you the most concern from the Ole Miss perspective?
It's always the Georgia defensive line versus the Ole Miss offensive line. Anytime you play Georgia, that's the matchup that you watch. If Georgia is affecting with their defensive line, the passer, and just blowing up everything you want to do, you're going to have problems. I call this a two-script game because Ole Miss is a script team, is probably the best offensive script team in the entire country. There's a good chance the opening drive of the game, Ole Miss is going to go down the field and score a touchdown. The problem for Ole Miss is from there it lulls. I think this is a two-script game for Ole Miss. I think that first drive, you need to script it a certain way to go down and score, and then have a completely different script that is also effective and plays for your script strengths, ready to immediately go to that to make Kirby and Glenn Schumann and those guys really start to think on the sideline and them not really sure what's going on, because Ole Miss needs to front run in this game. They do not need to be in a situation where they're trying to play catch up with the Georgia Bulldogs. That's suicide, honestly. 3rd and 10s and all of that, they make their living on that. Ole Miss needs to front run. They need to figure out a way to incorporate and get a good start. And if Ole Miss can get up 10 points in the first half, if Ole Miss can score 2 touchdowns, they're up 10-3 at the end of the first half. The second half, all of them intangibles that I talked about, with this being a Jackson Dart legacy game, a Lane Kiffin legacy game, 70,000 in Oxford, all of that's going to become a real issue, and the pressure is going to go down on Georgia, and then it's a game that Ole Miss can really win. But getting to the third quarter with that lead and getting everybody and keeping them energized is going to be massive in this football game.
Yeah, one thing, obviously he does so many things well, but one thing Kirby does really, really well is adjustments, whether that be at halftime, whether that just be, like you just mentioned, that first drive. And again, he does so many things well. You're not like the best coach in college football without doing a lot of things well. But the thing that I continue to be the most impressed with is just the way that they adjust. And so I think that's such a good point because yeah, they'll look like crap for an entire. I mean, look at the Bama game. Look at the way they adjusted in that Bama game at halftime, and just came out a completely different team. He does that so well, and so you're right. Like being prepared for that, being ready for that, whether it be in the second quarter, the second half, whatever, the fourth quarter, has to be something that at Ole Miss is ready for, because Kirby is so elite at adjusting. It's almost maddening how different of a team they can be from half to half in the way that they just seem to flip a switch and get better.
Yeah, and a lot of it has to do with they are so much better than everybody they play. The only team that gives them problems is Alabama, and lo and behold, that's the only team in America that has as many 4- and 5-star players as them.
You don't have to scratch your head too hard and figure out why that's the case. Yeah, I'll ask you this and we'll wrap. But you mentioned the defense, and Nolan. Like, do you have an X factor on defense that you feel like could have a really big game here and kind of change the tide? No pun intended. Kind of change the tide on Ole Miss's fortunes here.
Sontaran Perkins, he's the key. Walter Nolan's going to get double teamed every time, because if you don't double team Walter Nolan, he's a game wrecker and here to ruin it. I think they're going to double team Princely and Monmielen because he's scary, and Georgia knows through their rival with Florida that they have to pay attention to what's going on. Sontaran Perkins he's won 2 SEC Defensive Player of the Weeks in the last month, but he is an undersized outside linebacker. So he's 210 pounds. So has he gone against an offensive line as effective and as good as this Georgia offensive line is? He's got 8 or 9 sacks on the season as it is right now. Can he affect Carson Beck and at least make it to where other players like Jared Ivey or J.J. Pegues, they can win their one-on-ones, to where last year in the Ole Miss Georgia game, Carson Beck didn't have to wash his jersey afterwards. I mean, he was completely untouched. This year was completely built on getting pressure on Carson Beck. And if Ole Miss can do that and affect that, and the elements are like we expect them to be, this is going to be a good day for Ole Miss.
Yeah, can't wait to watch it. Can't wait to tune in and see it on Saturday. We've got some really good games overall on Saturday. But do you have a prediction in this one? Do you have a lean on what you think happens?
I am saying, and I went with this on my show today, talking about it. I think at the end of the first half, it's 10-3 Ole Miss. Ole Miss gets a touchdown on the script drive, and it turns into a slog during the game. Georgia adjusts and comes out and scores 10 points in the third quarter. It's 13-10. Ole Miss scores a late touchdown and wins 17-13.
I like it. I like it. You mentioned your show. Where can people follow you? Where can they find more of your work?
You can check me out on YouTube at Locked On Ole Miss. We're available also wherever you get your podcast online. You can catch me on Twitter at the Steven Willis. Basically, we like to have fun. Whenever I started doing this, it was about Ole Miss fans having a place to go where it can be fun again. There was during the 2014 and 2015 season, fans didn't really get to enjoy it because they were constantly worried about something's going on. So this is about having fun. We like to have a good time, a lot of interaction and all that. So stop on by if that suits your fancy, and hope you enjoy it.
Awesome, man. I appreciate you for taking some time. Hey, Lane's fun. We enjoy watching him and following what he does. So the show sounds like it fits that. But Steven, I appreciate your time this morning, man. Good luck this weekend.
Oh, no problem at all. And hey, anybody going to games, be safe this weekend.